Really a great pleasure for me to introduce in a couple of minutes Justice R.F. Nariman. I know on fairly good authority that he was going to be in his cricket flannels, and he's forsaken that for being with you in jacket and tie. Thank you very much for coming and addressing this conference. As was mentioned by the previous panel, I think Justice Nariman, as you all know through his judgments, has been by far, by a long distance, the most outstanding commercial judge we have on our Supreme Court. And it's really the work of one individual. I think it's in part fortuitous that we had the master of the roster assign the IBC judgments and cases to Justice Nariman's roster. Otherwise, I think by now the IBC would have sort of been something very different from what we have, a working statute. I think we're also very fortunate that the commercial roster in terms of arbitration has been with Justice Nariman, and we've had a huge number of judgments which have streamlined the arbitration law and have made it comprehensible for both practitioners in India as well as overseas. And the final point I think I'd like to make is that there are sort of bleak times sometimes in terms of public perception of the judiciary, and there are good times, but judges are somehow, or the public perception is often associated with an institution. The confidence of the public is often associated with one or two judges. I remember when I was in Bombay, initially there was Justice Pendse, and he commanded such a tremendous public confidence. And then later there was Justice Sri Krishna. And if something went wrong in the single judge, you said, we will take it to either Pendse's court or to Justice Sri Krishna's court. And I can say with a great degree of confidence that for the present Supreme Court, we are just absolutely delighted and also reassured by the presence of Justice R.F. Nariman, because he is really the face of public confidence in India in our Supreme Court as the apex institution. With that, may I request Justice Nariman to please address us on, I believe, the seat of arbitration. Thank you.
Justice Sri Krishna, Shyam, dignitaries from abroad, ladies and gentlemen. The theme of today's talk has been chosen by me as the scorching of three hydra heads of concurrent jurisdiction when it comes to the setting aside of arbitral awards. To begin at the beginning, in India, we had a village panchayat system. And that system worked fairly and well because it was mediation and arbitration very often rolled into one. And it is only when the courts in British India started controlling panchayat decisions that problems started arising. But one interesting thing is that in an early Privy Council judgment reported in AIR 1934 Privy Council 105, Sitamma versus Viranna, an interesting comment was made on the village panchayat system. And it said that not only is this quick, inexpensive, goes according to customary law, but also goes according to morality. That word is very interesting and important. And courts in British India should be loath to set aside these awards only because they do not agree with them or they do not agree with village morality. The same thing happened in England. You had an arbitrator, you chose him, you are lumped with him. And therefore, in the early days, you could challenge, or rather courts of the King's Bench and then courts in equity, to whom challenges were made to such awards, refused to set them aside on any ground except obvious bias or corruption worse still. Kent versus Elstop is perhaps the first decision in England in 1802, where the King's Bench started controlling by way of seeing that the arbitrator remains within the law and therefore had this error apparent of law exception, which in Hodgkinson versus Fernie many years later was stated to be a very unfortunate development of the law, because ultimately this is not administrative law and you are applying administrative law principles to arbitration. In America also, Justice Robert Grier in 1854, now this judge was a northern judge and one of the signatories to the famous Dred Scott versus Sanford opinion. He had his own opinion. He again made it clear that courts of equity will refuse to interfere with these arbitral awards, save and except maybe on 3 grounds. One, the obvious one of corruption or bias. The other, no full and fair hearing. And the third, equally obvious, that he stepped outside his jurisdiction. Now, one interesting aside about Justice Robert Grier. Justice Grier ultimately retired in 1871, having been riddled with several strokes. And Justice Stephen Field, who was one of a trilogy of 3 great brothers, but I don't have time to expound on that, was then deputed as one of the young judges, and he was the only 10th judge to ever serve on the US Supreme Court, to go and tell Justice Robert Grier to resign. Grier, poor chap, refused to resign. Field in turn had it coming back to him, because when he was very old, he was told by the great John Marshall Harlan, the great dissenter in Plessy and Ferguson, that this is what you did to Justice Robert Grier, and we must now request you to do the same. So he said, I never did a dirtier's day's work in my life, and refused finally to resign until he had beaten John Marshall's record of 34 years. But now coming back to our subject of the day. What is interesting is that in all these 3 jurisdictions, before any law was enacted, our first law, incidentally, was of 1859, the Civil Procedure Code. So before this, the interesting part was either there was no control over arbitration, or the control was by courts where the arbitral seat happened to be. Because in all these judgments you will find that the actual challenge was only made within the territorial jurisdiction of where the award was delivered. In a sense, we have come back now to that ancient challenge procedure. But then coming back to our statutory law, we have the 1859 Civil Procedure Code. In that, only existing and not future disputes could be referred, and could by and large be referred by courts in suits instituted. You then had an 1899 Act which applied only to the presidency towns, 3 presidency towns. Again, the important point that I am making is that at no stage in these early acts, including the 1940 Act, was there any concept of the place or seat of arbitration. The first time this actually occurs in our country is thanks to the Geneva Protocol. Because the Geneva Protocol, as you all know, was of 1923, just post World War I. And that had as grounds for refusing to recognize and enforce foreign awards the ground that the award has been annulled in the place in which it was made. So you had some shadowy concept of seat in the 23 Geneva Protocol, which then got translated into our law because we were signatories by the 1937 Protocol Convention Act. Then comes the 1940 Act, which is a purely domestic situation act. Again, that act had a couple of features which never included seat, because first and foremost, an award by itself could not be enforced in courts of law. An award had first to be filed in a court of law. After it was filed, the court then heard objections and either allowed those objections or dismissed those objections and then enforced the award. While this was so, court was defined in the original CPC sense, if I may say so. And it was defined by Section 21C of the 1940 Act as meaning any court which, if you were to see the subject matter of the reference and deem it to be the subject matter of a suit, would then have jurisdiction. And that meant that you would go back to sections 16 to 21 of the CPC. And jurisdiction, therefore, meant that where immovable property was situate, the courts where that property was situate would have jurisdiction, or where otherwise the defendant resided or carried on work for gain, or worst of all, where any part of the cause of action arises. Now, this being the case, there would have been complete confusion had there not been Section 31 in the 1940 Act. Because Section 31 said that the moment a particular award is to be filed in a particular court, that court then alone has size in to the exclusion of all other courts. This got carried into Section 42 now, 31(4) in particular of our 1996 Act. But what is interesting to note is that even in the 1940 Act, which was really a copy of the 1935 UK Act, there's nothing like seat. Then comes the New York Convention in 1958. And being signatories, we are one of the very early nations to have enacted a law in which we started enforcing the New York Convention in 1961. That again had this limited concept of seat, the same thing that the Geneva Convention had, that maybe you will not enforce something which has been annulled in the country of its, or the place where the award was made. With these shadowy concepts, both of seat as well as arbitration agreement being something different from the main agreement, etc., concurrent jurisdiction raised its first head in two early judgments. The first judgment was NTPC versus Singhal, which is the 1992 judgment, and it is under the 1940 Act. Now there, clearly the arbitration was to take place in London. English law was to apply. And what was stated was, look, if English law is to apply, where's the question of the 1940 Act giving an Indian court jurisdiction to set aside a London award? That argument failed on only one ground, and the ground was that Section 9 into brackets B of the Foreign Award Act says that an arbitration agreement governed by the law of India will be outside this Act. And they said an arbitration agreement is part of the main agreement. The main agreement is governed by Indian law, which is the substantive law of the contract, and therefore concurrent jurisdiction raised its first hydra head. So that you could have a London award which passes muster in England being set aside by an Indian court under the 1940 Act. Sumitomo followed suit in 1998. Also a judgment under the 1940 Act. And though it referred to Redfern and Hunter and made the neat distinction between the law of the contract, the law of the arbitration agreement, and the Curial law, unfortunately, exactly the same thing as was applied in Singha was done in Sumitomo, because they said there is no difference between the arbitration agreement, which is part and parcel of a larger agreement, and if the Indian law applies to that agreement, Indian courts get jurisdiction. Now, with this confusion, the first important legislative correction was the fact that Section 9B of the Foreign Awards Act was dropped in the 1996 Act. And the 96 Act now repealed these three older acts, the Convention Act, Foreign Awards Act, and the 40 Act. And now, under one rubric, had two parts which dealt with arbitration. The moment it had two parts, the important point now is that a model UNCITRAL law had intervened in 1985. And with that model law taken by the draftsman of the statute, we had certain portions of that law taken and certain portions of the old acts retained. And the problem that arose then was with meshing the two. Now, for example, the old definition of court continued, with one little change, that you can't have courts now of the lowest grade. you must have the principal district court of jurisdiction or the High Court, as the case may be, who have concurrent jurisdiction. The other problem was that despite now defining Part 1 arbitrations as being place or seat centric in section 2.2, you yet had this definition of court which came from the old 1940 Act, a purely domestic act with no view of international law. The other major problem was the UNCITRAL model law very clearly accepted section 9 of our 1996 Act, which was Article 9 of the UNCITRAL model law, by saying that if a party from abroad wants to have recourse to courts in India, where the seat is outside India, but only for interim orders, it may do so. So Article 9 was an exception to Part 1 applying in the model law. Somehow or the other, we didn't translate it into our 1996 Act. Now, because of these two things, namely the old courts come back, and this was not translated, the second Hydra head of concurrent jurisdiction now raises its head. And that was in the famous Bhatia International case. And the judge who decided that case, being a dear friend of ours, was very exercised by the fact that there would be no other remedy. And rightly so, because the model law envisaged this, which our people did not translate into action. So, concurrent jurisdiction this time came in the form of Part 1 applying or not applying. And with the anxiety to apply Part 1 and Section 9 only in particular, the entire baby and the bathwater were applied. In this case, the opposite, instead of just the baby. So the problem now was that when you wanted 9 to apply, the entire panoply of Part 1 comes in, which found its ultimate expose in Venture Global in 2008, where you had a foreign award being treated as a domestic award, with again the second bite at the same cherry. So we had this confusion largely because the model law somehow or the other was not followed so far as Section 9 was concerned. And this got corrected only finally by a 5-judge bench 10 years later, and ultimately pursuant to the Law Commission report by legislation. Because it's only when legislation comes in and now expressly by a proviso says that 9 will apply, bringing the position back to the model law, that we are back to square one. So this concurrent jurisdiction was one other problem, second concurrent jurisdiction. Third problem, the moment BALCO now decides correctly that look, the moment you tie yourself to a seat, it's like an exclusive jurisdiction clause, and courts there alone must apply that law, and those courts alone have jurisdiction to the exclusion of all other courts. Yet, it said the BALCO regime will continue right until 2012, that is the date of delivery of that judgment. So then it fell upon the Supreme Court in subsequent judgments to clarify that this can only be if the seat doesn't happen to be outside, which was then done in turn in the second Reliance case, if I may call it that, in 2015. So that this other Hydra head which had now popped up and was going to continue for all agreements pre-2012 got scotched for agreements pre-2012 by saying that look, if we can divine from the agreement that the seat is not India, it is outside India, sorry, Part 1 is impliedly excluded. So this now was where we were at, when in 2011, slowly but surely, the seat doctrine started getting developed by our courts. We had a flurry of 3 judgments in 2011 itself, just before BALCO in 2012. The first of them was DOSCO by a single judge, where he found that despite the fact that the venue was stated to be abroad in Seoul, Korea, yet since the ICC rules applied, he held the seat couldn't possibly be India, it had to be Seoul. And Seoul therefore, and Seoul's courts therefore would have the exclusive jurisdiction to challenge such awards. The same thing was held in Videocon versus Indian Union of India, so far as Kuala Lumpur was concerned. And the third was Yograj Infrastructure, so far as Singapore was concerned. So you had this trilogy of judgments going in the correct direction. Then comes the very important judgment in Enercon. The author of that judgment was Justice Nijjar, who was the same author in Balco. And that was a peculiarly worded clause because all the three types of laws that would apply would be Indian. So whether it was Curial, whether it was the law of the arbitration agreement, whether it was the law of the contract, it was all Indian law. But the venue was London. Now, given that, he said venue would mean venue only, which is convenient place, and not seat, given the fact that all three laws were India. So it would be significant contra indicators to show that the seat could not possibly have been intended to be London on the facts of that case. But that case looked at three other very interesting judgments. One was an English judgment in Union versus McDonnell in 1993. And that judgment specifically said seat will be London. It used the word seat. But then said that the 1940 Indian Act will apply. So the courts in England then said that, look, once you have designated seat to be London, it is obvious that the 1940 Act will only apply for the procedure of the arbitration. At the highest, it will be the Curial law and won't possibly go to the law of challenge. Therefore, seat being London, the English courts alone have jurisdiction, exclusive jurisdiction. You have the exact opposite in a case which came from Scotland, also discussed in that judgment, Braes of Doon. And Braes of Doon is a 2008 judgment where Glasgow is now designated as the seat. But they say that the UK law will be the law of the arbitration agreement. That being so, the court correctly held that, look, if the law governing the arbitration agreement is English law, obviously the challenge procedure has to be English law, it can't be Scot law. Therefore, seat here must be read as venue. And Glasgow now became venue. Then you had the third type of case, which is the Roger Shashwa case in England first, where you had venue as London. And you had what they call a supranational body of rules governing the ICC rules. They said in the absence of any significant contrary indicia, obviously venue here must mean seat, as a result of which exclusive jurisdiction goes to English courts. Now, with this laying down of the law in Enercon, things became a little clearer. And they started getting clearer and clearer as progress occurred. The next judgment was Harmony Shipping in 2015, which said pretty much the same thing. 2016 had a judgment which was the Eisenbulk judgment, which quoted a very interesting passage from Redfern and Hunter, stating that, look, if an English woman drives her car from London to Paris and crosses the channel, obviously she is going to be governed by French law. She is not going to choose to be governed by French law. So she will suddenly have to shift from the left side to the right side of the road, which are the traffic rules in France. This is exactly the same thing that you do when you choose that your arbitration will take place in place X. It is obvious that the laws of that place X alone then will control the process. So Eisenbulk also went in the same direction. After that, you had three interesting judgments in 2017. First being the IMAX Corporation judgment. Here again there was an interesting nuance. No seat designation, only the ICC rules. ICC designates London. When ICC designates London, that was good enough for the court to say, all right, London is the seat. Again, exclusive jurisdiction. Second judgment is a pure Indian judgment, which is the Indus, that Datawin judgment, where in an Indian context, again the same thing was followed. And they said, despite the fact that Mumbai courts would have exclusive jurisdiction, otherwise also, it was clear that Mumbai was designated in a domestic arbitration, purely domestic, to be the seat of the arbitral process, which meant it was like an exclusive jurisdiction court, all other courts would be out. Now, the difficulty which still confronted us was the definition of court, which continues to remain in our statute book. So, two Hydra heads had now gone, one removed by legislation and case law, the other by case law. The third now which remained was, what do we do with this definition of court? Because court as defined under the 40 Act would mean court in the CPC sense. So the moment a part of a cause of action takes place in some remote area in Arunachal Pradesh and somebody goes there first with an application, out you go because of section 42. So you've got to go to Arunachal Pradesh for your challenge procedure. When the court was faced with this again in a domestic situation, that is in the latest BJS Soma case, the court then had to resolve a conflict that arose out of the 5-judge bench judgment in Balco. Balco did a great job but left two things. One, the prospective overruling part which was undone by the second Reliance case. And the second and more important, another Hydra head of concurrent jurisdiction, but this time in another sense. What Justice Nijjar tried to do was now to infuse the doctrine of seat into the definition of court. And he said, look, we must have seat, which is given pride of place in part 1, also infuse somehow or the other into court. And he did that by saying, subject matter of arbitration is not the same as subject matter of suit. And if subject matter of arbitration is not the same, then subject matter of arbitration must necessarily go to seat. But in saying so, he then had an illustration which showed that it would apply only to a neutral venue and not other venues. So again, we were in a soup. So a division bench finally had to say that, look, the only way of reconciling all this is to say that seat gets primacy. Seat has got primacy all over the world. Seat is basic to the UNCITRAL model law, which we have adopted. This is a hangover of the past, despite the fact that we can't score it out. The least that we can do is to give it a back seat. And it was given a back seat by saying that the moment, in accordance with certain well-defined tests, you are able to say that X is the seat, it becomes an exclusive jurisdiction clause. The fact that 42 requires you to follow the drill of where the first application is would not apply to courts without jurisdiction. So therefore, the court got around it by saying that when 42 applies, it speaks of courts having jurisdiction in the first place. And you had jurisdiction in the first place only if, in a seat designated agreement, party autonomy is given effect to, and not this ancient definition of court. So finally, we've come around, full circle. And in doing so, ultimately, we have to also somehow or the other get over Hardy. Now, Hardy is another 3-judge bench. And a 3-judge bench was confronted with a decision in Hardy which was 3-judge. And it cannot therefore directly overrule it. And what Hardy did was again to go in the reverse direction. Because Hardy was a judgment where Kuala Lumpur was designated as the venue and the UNCITRAL model law was made applicable. The judge reasoned in Hardy that the UNCITRAL model law itself then said that where there is no designation of seat, and here there is none because it says venue, Kuala Lumpur says venue, then there must be designation. In the absence of designation, sorry, and if there is no such designation, back to India, back to concurrent jurisdiction, back to Venture Global. So, a 3-judge bench now had to confront Hardy. And fortunately, the way out was that Roger Shashwa, the English judgment, because there are 2 Roger Shashwas, one is the 2009 UK judgment and one a 2017 judgment of our courts. The English judgment was expressly approved, fortunately, by a 5-judge bench, given our drill here, you see. So, since it was expressly approved by 5 judges, and since it said that the moment venue is used, it means seat, in the absence of significant contrary indicia, and coupled with the fact that a supranational body of rules will apply. Now here, you apply that test, Kuala Lumpur is venue, supranational is the UNCITRAL model law, it's not national, and therefore, it must inexorably lead to the conclusion that Kuala Lumpur is the seat, but the opposite conclusion was derived by Hadi. So the court therefore said that Hadi, in not going down the Shashwa route, which was directly approved by 5 judges, is contra to 5 judges. And because it is contra to 5 judges, it is no longer good law. So this last act of cleanup was very important. And finally, therefore, we've come round full circle to the old village panchayat with which I started. That now, even in a purely domestic situation, the moment a seat is found to be designated by the well-settled rules which are laid down in BGS Soma from many judgments, it amounts to an exclusive jurisdiction clause. All other courts are out. So, with this, we are still struggling in the judiciary to set the arbitration law right. So far, like Hercules, the court, I think, has performed about 7 labors. 5 are yet to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justice Nariman, for this absolutely dazzling and illuminating lecture and talk on seat of arbitration and linking it up both with the history. It would seem as if there are no challenges ahead which lie, but I suspect that there's going to be all sorts of problems which continue. Yeah. Very well. So several challenges remain. But thank you very, very much for this brilliant exposition. May I request all of the audience to just